Nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is. Get used to it. Get on with it, girl.
The first part of that is nihilistic, and the second part isn't. So how do you reconcile those two things? Why get on with it, girl? I mean, what about the biology that they're given?
Well, we start with the biology, and the memes build on top of that.
Nah, the memes are biology too.
And that's exactly what I do.
What I said at the beginning is that the atheist types act out a religious structure and criticize it.
Welcome back to Rattlesnake TV, guys. In this video, we are going to watch one of my favorite debates of all time between Jordan Peterson and atheist Susan Blackmore. Now, this is a fascinating conversation between two individuals who are very intelligent and also very respectful. And I'm going to be posing some pretty deep questions here. So I want your absolute best, strongest, most thoughtful and tasteful comments below. I want this one to be on fire. So let's watch the first part in regards to how Jordan Peterson was feeling at this time, which poses a very interesting question, especially for Christians.
Do you just tend to describe yourself as a religious man at all?
I would definitely describe myself as a religious man, yeah. I think that's fundamentally true. The devil's in the details. So what does that mean exactly?
I've seen you being asked the question, do you believe in God? And that's not a question you necessarily find it terribly easy to answer.
Well, I don't know what people mean when they say believe. Like it's as if that question explains itself when it's asked. It's like it doesn't. What do you mean by believe? And what do you mean by God? And what makes you think that the question that I'm answering is the same one that you're asking? This is not something that you can say yes or no to in any straightforward manner. So I find it an off-putting question. And I don't think it's because I'm avoiding the issue. I think that to answer it properly requires books and lectures. So,
do you see yourself at least in the Christian tradition as far as your, I suppose, worldview?
Well, there's no doubt about that because I'm a Westerner. There's no escape from that.
Yeah.
I'm conditioned in every cell as a consequence of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so I've read a fair bit in other religious traditions and have a reasonable grasp on some of them, I would say, not trying to overestimate my knowledge, but we're saturated in Judeo-Christian ethics. And so
I've seen you say that you certainly live your life as though God exists.
Yes, I would say, well, to the best of my ability. Right. Yeah. And I think that that's the fundamental hallmark of belief is it's how you act, not what you say about what you think you think.
Sure.
What do you know about what you think? Seriously. I mean, we wouldn't need a psychology, an anthropology, a sociology, any of the humanities if our thoughts were transparent to ourselves. They're not in the least.
So that's a really interesting one for me in regards to how one is meant to act if they are a Christian. And here's the question. On one hand, you've got somebody who is a true believer. They absolutely believe the word. However, they've never really read the Bible. They don't really understand the philosophical ideas. They commit all kinds of gratuitous sin and don't really understand what it means to give your life to Jesus. But then on the other hand, you have a more skeptical individual, somebody who tries to be as learned as possible about the subjects, but also has a few philosophical quibbles about some of the ideas and the historical accuracy of the Bible. However, this individual leads a life that is much more in accordance with the teachings of the Bible. Of these two people, who is a better Christian? Let me know your thoughts below, guys. I'd be very interested to hear your points of view.
And you've been,
in the least they are, but
you've been willing to be quite critical as well of some of the new atheists. So Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins. What have you made of their particular way of approaching religion?
They just don't take it seriously enough. As far as I'm concerned, they don't contend with the real thinkers.
I know all three of them very well, and I have deep, great arguments with them, and they seem to be taking it seriously. I know what you mean. There's a certain sort of superficiality in the writings of all of them, but as people, I find they really care about these issues.
Care. Yeah. They care. There's no doubt about that, and it's not like I'm not sympathetic to the atheist or rationalist claim. I'm perfectly sympathetic to it, but I don't believe that the level of discussion that's characteristic of Dawkins and Dennett and Sam Harris, say, approaches the level of complexity of, say, Friedrich Nietzsche or Dostoevsky.
Well, that would be asking quite a lot, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but if you're going to play in that arena, man, you're going to play with the heavyweights.
But what I've noticed is it's a lot of people who maybe up to a point, have been interested in what those people have been saying from the new atheist side, who are also interested in what you're saying. There's an interesting sort of correlation there.
Yeah, definitely.
And why is it that, especially some of these, potentially, I see a lot of men in this audience are coming to you, Jordan, to sort of sit at your feet and hear what you have to say at this point?
Guys, if you enjoy these more philosophical videos, then leave a like. The like ratio helps me to understand which videos you guys like and don't. And also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, then what are you waiting for? Come and join the community. Back to the clips.
Well, the new atheists have a hell of a time with an active ethic. They say, well, you can build an ethic on rationality. It's like, well, first of all, that's not self-evident. It's possible, but it's by no means self-evident. And their essential existential concept is rather hollow. Like with Harris, for example, when I talked to him twice on 2 different podcasts, and we never really got to his sense of what the ideal society might be. But I've read his writings on the maximization of well-being, for example, and it's just not going anywhere. You can't even measure it properly. And if you're thinking about something like that scientifically, that turns out to be like, that's not a problem. It's a catastrophic problem.
But Sam really goes deeply into the consequences of meditation, and he tells stories about his own experience of how behavior changes. Compassion seems to arise naturally. This is not based on rationality, which is not everything, and I would agree with you there. It's based on practical experience, training in observing one's own thoughts, which is also of interest to you, and in the way behavior changes in ways which he would say, and also query whether it's true, that it's better behavior.
Well,
that being compassionate and kind to people is better. We can't have some great underlying reason why. If you don't have God, it's a very difficult question. You've got to find some basis. But even without one, Sam is trying to say, as I would, that if you spend a lot of time meditating and really becoming to understand yourself and see the consequences of certain thoughts and actions, then better actions follow. That's one of the things I like about his work.
Well, and I'm certainly not questioning his ethical integrity or his commitment to these problems, although I certainly don't think that compassion or kindness constitutes a sufficient grounds for a transcendent ethic. Not in the least. Partly because both, and I can speak about that technically to some degree. Compassion is associated with trait agreeableness fundamentally, and agreeableness is a great short-term strategy for infants, but it's a very bad medium to long-term strategy for adults, and it's by no means the ground upon which an entire complex society can rest. And that's partly what you see playing out right now in the political world, because the politically correct types are very high in compassion. We have research that demonstrates that. But that ethic doesn't work for a sophisticated society.
Now, in terms of atheism and compassion and the idea that we can all just sort of meditate and think logically and just act with compassion all the time without any objective morality or moral authority doesn't really make much sense to me. Sure, there are great atheist people out there. I know a lot of them. And if you are an atheist, if that is your worldview, you can still be a moral, loving, respectful, intelligent person and all of that. However, when I see altruism on a broader scale in terms of charity and missions and living a truly selfless life, it generally tends to be religious people. And don't get me wrong, I think that religion taken to its absolute dogmatic extreme can also be authoritarian and bad. But look at the United States, for example. It's not the Christians who are in the street having parties about being able to have abortions. It's not the Christians who are trying to indoctrinate children into these weird, strange sexual ideologies, or any of the other heinous incarnations of modernity for that matter. I mean, sure, there will definitely be some bad ones, and you could, as an atheist, make the case that here's a laundry list of the terrible things that have been done in the name of religion. And Christians sin all the time. But what I'm talking about is specifically the degeneracy happening in the West. This is something that is almost exclusively done by atheists. And it makes sense because when you think about it, that worldview aligns with this. They don't have the same necessity to preserve life, because the atheist worldview suggests that we're all just matter, we're all just clumps of cells. There is no objective meaning, we don't have a soul, we don't have God-given dignity or an essence worth preserving. And there is no objective sexual morality if morality is simply subjective. And if this is something that just changes with the seasons and whatever is culturally trendy. And it's important to note here that I'm more talking about the woke atheist types. Like I said before, I know a lot of people who would consider themselves atheists who have a very strong grasp on morality. They just don't have a very good explanation for its origins. And now for a discussion about memes and archetypes, which is absolutely fascinating. And just for some context here, Richard Dawkins' meme theory, which they're about to discuss here, is the idea of a cultural inheritance, where ideas that shape our culture are passed down like human genes are through reproduction.
You're well known for picking up the idea of memes that sort of originated at some level with Richard Dawkins, the idea of an idea propagated across generations. And you even went as far as to describe religion as a virus of the mind in terms of its
that was Richard's term, but yes, okay.
Is that a kind of view you would still stand by today?
Yes, but you've got to be careful about what you mean by a virus. I mean, I think if I often say in lectures, imagine a continuum between what you mean as being a virus of the mind. It's really bad. You know, it's like the flu virus or
usually
AIDS
we
or
think
something.
of a virus in negative terms.
And, yes, and they aren't always. So imagine that you think, you know, religions is utterly bad, or you think religion's utterly wonderful and utterly good, and all in between. I think Richard is way down there, and I'm somewhere here. I think by and large, on balance, the world would be a better place without any religions. But the religions would not thrive if they didn't have within them things which are positive. I mean, we know at a personal level, at a society level, the worst societies are more religious. At a personal level, there's evidence that people are happier and they have better social connections and so on if they're religious. So I don't think we would be stuck with these horrible memes if it weren't for the fact that they also have some good qualities.
What do you make of the whole meme theory and the fact that Sue does feel ultimately...
I think it's a shallow derivation of the idea of archetype, and that Dawkins would do well to read some Jung. In fact, if he thought farther and wasn't as blinded by his a priori stance about religion, he would have found that the deeper explanation of meme is in fact archetype.
I disagree. I mean,
Can you just first of all explain archetype for those who are not perhaps familiar with that particular psychological
Well, an archetype is partly a pattern of behavior that's grounded in biology. So it's the behavior itself. So you could think about that as both the instinct and the manifestation of that instinct, but it's also the representation of that pattern. So part of what's coded in our mythological stories, for example, are images of typical patterns of behavior. And those are the typical patterns of behavior that make us human. I really want to have this discussion about memes, by the way, because it's really a discussion that needs to be had. Because I think that the meme idea is very interesting, and I do think that there are contagious ideas, but that needs to be chased down much deeper, because there are ideas that are so contagious that we've actually adapted to them biologically. And once that happens, they're no longer merely memes. They're something else. They're built into us. I can give you...
These archetypes, as you described.
Yeah, well, I can give you a kind of example of that. So imagine, I'll have to try to do this relatively rapidly. It's very complicated, so I'm hoping I can do it. So imagine that we live in dominance hierarchies. We don't have to imagine that. That happens to be the case. They're at least 350 million years old. So they're really, really old. So the idea of the archetype of dominance is older than our ability to perceive trees, right? It's really down there. And our nervous system is fully adapted to the existence of dominance hierarchies. It's one of the things the serotonergic system tracks. Okay, so now we also know that your position in a dominance hierarchy, especially if you're male, is proportionate to your reproductive success. The higher you up in the hierarchy, the more likely you are to succeed. Okay, so what that means is that males have been selected for their ability to move up a dominance hierarchy. But that's not quite right. They've been selected for their ability to move up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies. And that's a very abstract set. And there's a set of characteristics that go along with the ability to move up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies that's represented in religious terms as the optimal ethical manner in which to conduct yourself.
I see.
And that's not a meme that's casually passed from person to person. It's way deeper than that.
I think you're being unfair to memes. I would make this response here about the difference between memes and archetypes. So archetypes are there whether we have memes or not. All of that history of evolution is there.
Yes.
So we have, ideas about sex differences or ideas about dominance is a very good example that don't require memes. They can then become memes. And a meme by definition, as Dawkins started it out, is that which is imitated. or that which is copied from person to person. So the idea of dominance hierarchies can be a meme, and all the ideas we build on top of that, as long as we pass it from person to person. Now,
we could certainly think of hierarchies of memes from
yes, indeed,
from ones that are no more than fads that wash across the culture to ones that are permanent. But you were kind of
trivializing memes, and I think the power of the idea of memes is this: we have the first replicator, genes on the planet, and we know the consequences of that, producing all these organisms. But the idea about memes is that they are a second replicator. So genes are copied by chemical processes in bodies. Memes are copied by imitation and other kinds of interactions between human beings, and very little in any other species at all. And that's what gives rise to culture. So the whole theory about memes is one of many ways of trying to understand the evolution of culture. And in that way, I say it's not trivial at all.
Quick response, and I want to move on to talking about the 12 rules, Jordan.
Well, the issue is what happens when a meme is so widely distributed that it becomes a determining factor in evolution itself. Because it translates...
meme gene co-interaction.
Yes, exactly. Well, see, that's where I think. Well, that's where I think the religious. For me, that's the grounds of the essential religious instinct. It's a meme gene interaction, and it goes back forever.
Yes.
And then I'll finish with this. See, because once you see that there's a meme gene interaction and that there's selection in favor of a certain meme, let's say, then you open up the entire question of what constitutes the underlying reality. Because
indeed,
see, this is something I tried to have a talk with about Sam Harris, and we augured in very rapidly. You could say that reality is that which selects. Now, it's not exactly a materialist viewpoint. It's more of an evolutionary viewpoint. And if reality is that which selects, then what's selected by that reality is in some sense correct. Now, that's not... this is why
you're adding on that's a big claim you're adding on now.
I know it's a big claim. I understand it's a big claim, but it's also the central claim of pragmatism.
So memes versus archetypes, a really interesting concept. And I think the two are different, but I do agree with Dr. Peterson in the sense that if you take memes to their conclusion, you probably end up with archetypes. However, I do see the difference and how memes are more in line with the atheistic worldview, whereby we can observe how culture is created on the surface level through the exchange of ideas. And these ideas are passed down through people and generations, whereas archetypes are more about the collective unconscious. Archetypes suggest that there's something that we share collectively that we can all tap into in some sort of a mysterious way. And this begs the question, are these stories that are given to us because we are made in the image of God, or is this just the result of evolution and of our brains developing over millions of years? I'll let you guys discuss in the comments.
See, I do believe that the biblical texts are foundational. I believe it in the Nietzschean sense. And, Nietzsche, of course, announced famously in the late 1800s that God was dead. And the typical rationalist atheist regards that as a triumphalist proclamation. But that wasn't that for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche knew perfectly well and said immediately afterward that the consequences of that was going to be bloody catastrophe because everything was going to fall. And he predicted the rise of communism, for example, and the deaths of tens of millions of people in the aftermath of the death of God. Because Nietzsche knew perfectly well that when you pull the cornerstone out from underneath a building, that even though it may stay aloft in midair like a cartoon character that's wandered off a cliff for some period of time, that it will inevitably crumble and that it will be replaced by something that's perhaps far worse. Now, Nietzsche hoped it would be replaced by man's ability to recreate meaning spontaneously out of his psyche, for example, which I think is a doomed enterprise. But he knew that in the interval, it would be replaced by both nihilism and by communist totalitarianism, which is a hell of a prediction because it was done like 40 years before the events actually unfolded.
Well, so, you can see it that way, but if that is the case, why do we have evidence that the most dysfunctional societies today are the most religious? And for example, in the United States of America, the higher, if you go across different states, the higher belief in God is proclaimed belief in God, whatever you think that means, the more murders, suicide, marital breakdown, various measures of dysfunctional society are.
Well, it depends on how you define religion in part. I mean, first of all, America is a very religious country. And to think of it as a country that's doing worse than other countries in the world is just not the case
Well, its incarceration rate is higher than any other.
Well, true, but so is its standard of living and its what would you say, ability to provide the basic basic essentials of life for people and the essential freedoms that go along with that. You wouldn't compare that to an African dictatorship.
No. But most of these studies have been done only in developed societies. But there, if you look at income inequality, that's much worse in the States. So yes, a lot of people in the States have a very high standard of living, but the poorest are really poor.
Yes, well, income inequality.
With Obamacare being dismantled and so on. Well, but nevertheless, let me go back to that point. We know that more dysfunctional societies have higher proclaimed belief, higher attendance in church, and so on. Now, this doesn't fit with what you were saying. Now, Nietzsche's ideas are very profound and interesting, but I just want to stop you from saying that he was absolutely right about somehow if we get rid of God, we're going to be worse, because we have very well-functioning societies in Scandinavia,
we were pretty bad in the 20th century.
Oh, we were, yes. People were.
And we could easily drift that way again.
And there have been terrible bad things done in the name of God, and there have been terrible bad things done in the name of communism and atheism. I don't think we can. I don't want to weigh them up.
I'll weigh them up.
You'll weigh them up and you'll say...
No problem.
But then you have to go against this evidence that I've just stated.
Jordan, come back on this evidence. I mean, obviously, from her perspective, Sue feels like actually we've got pretty stable societies that are increasingly secular these days. So perhaps Nietzsche was wrong, and in fact, we're not going to see this moral
Well, I would say
decay.
they're stable to the degree that they're actually not secular. And this is also a Nietzschean observation, and a Dostoevskian observation for that matter, is that we're living on the corpse of our ancestors, like we always have. That's a very old idea, but that stops being nourishing and starts to become rotten unless you replenish it. And I don't think we are replenishing it. We're in danger of we're living on borrowed time and in danger of running out of it. I think that the reason that the Western societies essentially work quite well is because they act out a Judeo-Christian ethic, and one that's essentially predicated on utmost regard for the sovereignty of the individual. So the individual is sovereign in relationship to the state, which is a remarkable idea and one that's fundamentally religious in its essence, in my mode of thinking, and that's also predicated on honest speech. And there's other predicates as well, but those are religious predicates in my estimation.
Living on the corpses of our ancestors, very deep and very true point, and also that we need to replenish it, which we are most certainly not doing. On that topic, guys, it's no surprise to me that countries that are more wealthy are more atheist. Just as it's no surprise to me that a spoiled child from a rich family that's had everything handed to them is much more likely to rebel against their parents and resent them. As societies become more wealthy and move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people become less and less attached to the fundamentals because they don't need them anymore, or so they think. There are no invading tribes, there are no wars going on, so men don't need to be stoic and in good physical condition and ready to protect and die for the ones that they love, so instead they can sit around and play video games all day. Or, hey, men can have periods now. There is no absolute need to have children so that you can repopulate the tribe and keep the bloodline going for women, so they can just be single and childless with a boxed wine subscription and a cat. This is exactly what happens as societies become more wealthy and urbanized. So it's not a case of them becoming more wealthy because they went away from God. It's a case of them going away from God because they became more wealthy. And this is a bubble that, in my mind, will pop 100% of the time because human beings have a religious instinct and they will find something to worship. So it may as well be a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, transcendent, all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful, benevolent father, because otherwise something else will come along, most likely in the form of ideology or human being, both of which inescapably fallible and destructive. But then this begs the very fair atheist question of, are we clinging to God in these hard times to ease our troubled minds? And is this some sort of a psychological trick that we play on ourselves? And another objection there might be, yes, societies are built on religious values, but just because these ideas have such great value doesn't necessarily mean that God is real. And I know what I think about those questions, but I'd be very interested to know what you guys think. So make sure you let me know below. And now on to the last bit where the two discuss whether or not Susan is acting out a religious instinct of her own.
It's built into our emotions and our motivations.
This issue with rationalism and the Enlightenment and so on, where you feel that those who appeal to that as somehow we're in this golden age now are forgetting that it's all built on a much deeper, longer evolutionary psychological history, which is completely different to rationalism per se.
Yeah, well, I see a university professor. Let's take Dawkins, for example. He's the sovereign, rational individual, but there's a wall around him That's the wall, let's say, of his university. And then outside the university, there's the wall of the town. And outside the town, there's the wall of the state and the wall of the country. And there's just these concentric rings that are protecting him. And he can stand in the middle and say, well, I'm divorced from all that. It doesn't undergird me. It's like it undergirds you to a degree that you can't possibly imagine. And you're living on the, well, really it is the resources that have been gathered painfully and bloodily in the past, and saying, well, we can just detach ourselves from that and float off. It's like, no, you can't. You don't understand what you're talking about.
All that leads me to gratitude for all that we have. I mean, I recognize that. I recognize that nothing to do with any religious basis at all. I recognize that I could not come on the train here, have a really interesting discussion, meet Justin again, have a nice glass of cool water, without a load of other people doing it for me. That gratitude, which is one of the things that you quite rightly put into your book, it gives good place to it, and it's very important. That doesn't come from anything religious, unless you say because I was brought up a Christian it came from there, but I don't base it on that anymore.
What do you think it comes from?
I think it comes from a recognition that I've done a lot of meditation. I've meditated every day for 30 years, and I think this has something to do with it, but it's observing the inner consequences of different ways of confronting the world. And I'm much more in recent years in the habit of waking up in the morning, even if it's raining in January in England, and looking out and going, oh, yeah, and it's a feeling of gratitude, not gratitude towards God or towards anybody or anything, just free-floating gratitude. That seems to have a positive consequence. I set the day up better, and it's kind of self-perpetuating. It pops up again and again.
Do you think you can just have gratitude in general, or must gratitude always be given towards something and ultimately God?
That's a good question. That goes back to our discussion about acting things out. Like, gratitude is something you feel towards something. And you can say, well, I don't feel it towards anything in particular. And I would say, all right, well, the diffuse nothing that you feel it towards serves in your psychological hierarchy as your equivalent of God.
No, but it's gratitude. This morning, for example, I looked out and it was so green. We've had frosts and it's been white the last few days, and it was green this morning, and it was just gratitude to the universe, if you like. It's not really God because it's not a creator. It's not anything I can pray to. I know.
Why feel gratitude towards it then?
I don't know, but I find
That's fine.
I know that you tackle in this book that happiness is not an ultimate good, and I struggle this right.
It's not an ultimate goal.
Oh, okay,
I didn't say it wasn't an ultimate
all
good.
All right, okay.
There's a big difference between those things.
You're right. You picked me up correctly on that. Nevertheless, we are happiness-seeking creatures, and I have found through practice and growing older that acting gratitude, thinking gratitude, feeling gratitude makes me happier and seems to rub off on other people.
So I don't think we are happiness-seeking creatures, and I think it's a low goal. Not because there's something wrong with being happy, because, thank God if you get to be happy now and then. But I don't think that that's what we seek. I think we seek a meaning that's deep enough to sustain us through tragedy. And that is way different.
Do you know, when I hit tragedy is too strong a word. I think that but when horrible things happen to me, or I feel or I read some terrible thing going on in the world, yes, those are tragedies going on in the world, my response is, nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is. Get used to it. Get on with it, girl.
That sounds like a very Zen Buddhist way of dealing.
I guess it is.
Meaning.
Well, it's a paradoxical way, though, because the first part of that is nihilistic, and the second part isn't. So how do you reconcile those two things? Why get on with it, girl?
Because well, here's another thing. I've often done this with my students. Let's suppose you become nihilistic. Nothing matters. There's no point in doing that. I think we live in a pointless universe. What are you going to do? And I say to them, like William James in his wonderful thing about getting up in the morning, but that's a slightly different point that he makes there. But I say to them, okay, tomorrow morning when you wake up, think it's all pointless. There's no point in doing anything. Now, what are you going to do? Well, actually, you're going to need to go to the loo. You're going to get out of bed and you're going to go to the bathroom. And when you're there, you'll think, actually, I'm hungry. I think I want to go down to the kitchen. I probably should put my slippers on. Why don't I get dressed? You go and have something to eat. And then you think, I'm bored. And you go to university and go into your lectures. And, we are not creatures who will just not do anything. To me, to go through that process, which I've done in the past a lot, and it's just natural now, is a very positive way of living. To accept the meaningless and ultimate emptiness of everything, and accept that this creature here, this thing, this evolved creature just will get on with life.
But you're not accepting the meaninglessness of it, even by going through those actions that you described.
You don't think so?
Not at all, because you're acting as if those things are meaningful.
Yes, I am. I'm acting as though those
are you pretending that they're meaningful?
Pardon?
Are you pretending that they're meaningful?
No, I'm not pretending. My way of putting it would be that those meanings are constructed by myself and others.
They're personal
and they're because the kind of creatures we are, because of the meme
But they're not constructed.
I'd like to hear
Hunger
Jordan's
isn't
response to
constructed. Neither is your desire to use the loo. None of that's constructed.
No. But the fact that there is a loo is part of culture.
Yeah, well, thank God for that.
Yeah.
But
thank God, would you, for that? Sorry, that's a poor joke.
Well, you see, so imagine this. You have the proximal meanings that you described that are sort of a priori, right?
Yep.
They're handed to you. You might consider them as needs or drives, although they're not. They're personalities. That's not the right way of conceptualizing them. But then there's the intermingling of all those needs and drives, let's say, and that constitutes a new layer of structure, because it isn't just that you have to eat and that you have to use the washroom and that you have to have something to drink and that you have to be warm enough or cool enough to survive. It's that you have to do all those things at the same time in a situation where you're going to have to propagate that across time, and you're going to have to do it with a bunch of other people. And it's always been like that. And so what that means is that out of those proximal meanings, higher meanings arise. And you might say, well, those meanings are arbitrary, and I would think those are religious meanings.
I wouldn't say they are arbitrary, but I would say they were constructed. And it's very interesting. Reading your book...
What do you mean by constructed?
Well, they are a consequence of mimetic evolution, of the language that people are brought up in, the culture they live in, the arguments they have. I mean...
What about the biology that they're given?
Well... We start with the biology, and the memes build on top of that.
Now, the memes are biology too.
Well, by definition, they are, well...
See, this is the thing.
I would follow Dawkins in saying, well, talk about genes as biology, talk about memes as culture. That's all I meant by dividing that. But let me say this.
Yeah, but I don't accept that division.
But I want to get back to what we're saying about meaning. Reading your book made me think a lot about what you mean by meaning, and your claim that we should have a meaningful life or strive for a meaningful life, that meaningfulness is important. And I kept asking myself, do I live that way? What meanings does my life have? And, if I think of something like, well, most of my striving goes into writing my books. And is that meaningful? And again, I have the same response when I ask myself that question. It's just what this body does.
Then you should listen to the body and stop listening to the thing that's criticizing it.
And what would the body say?
It would say, write your book and try to be as clear as you possibly can about it.
That's what I do. And that's exactly what I do.
What I said at the beginning is that the atheist types act out a religious structure and criticize it.
Okay, so this is fascinating to me. I find it really interesting how atheists will try and describe how they find peace and meaning, even if they don't say as much, in a universe that is ultimately meaningless. A universe where we are all just stardust bumping into each other, and where fish became philosophers. It's also very interesting to me how their practices always tend to resemble religious practices. For example, practicing meditation, manifestation, and putting your good vibes and energy out to the universe.
Going to open up our energy points to actually allow ourselves to connect better to the universe.
This to me seems to be a different incarnation of the idea of prayer and having a relationship with God. And it makes you wonder, why is it that these patterns always emerge throughout history and cross-culturally? Why do we have these unconscious behaviors and storylines that seem to resonate with us all but manifest in different ways? Memes versus archetypes, prayers versus meditation, having faith in God versus trusting in the universe. What do you think when you hear this? Do these ideas suggest to you some sort of objective framework, or is this all just neurons firing around in our brains? And are we just terrified of death and making these stories up to appease our existential dread? Looking forward to hearing what you guys have got to say. And if you guys want to check me out on Locals and support the channel and get weekly exclusive content, then you can hit that link below. And if you want to subscribe to the channel, click right here. If you want to watch another video, right here. Until next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.